It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavoured to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful, great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same colour as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shrivelled complexion and straight black lips. Okay, so we're going to annotate this extract now. And the first thing I notice is that the opening line mentions a dreary night of November. And not only is the weather suggested to be dreary here, but it's nighttime, which already suggests mystery and suspense and things being hidden in the dark. This increases our sort of sense of tension and fear, which is something we might want to write about later, so I'm highlighting it now. Also, it's November, which as we know is a winter month here in the UK, and the book suggests that there is going to be some kind of evil deed about to happen from the fact that it is a winter month, and it's by that account is colder and more fearful, more frightening anyway. Then we've got this use of assonance here. We've got an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, so I'm going to highlight that. We've then also got instruments of life. Now, in this quotation, instruments does not mean musical instruments, but rather tools that he's going to use or has already used to build this creature, the instruments of life. So that's a metaphor, because it's not talking about, there can't be literally instruments of life. It's more of a concept. It's metaphorical, these tools of life. Then we get down a little bit further. We've got more references to the settings. We've got 1 a.m. and the rain pattering dismally. So we've got some pathetic fallacy here with the rain pattering dismally, and also the time, 1 o'clock in the morning. This is a time when all sorts of activities could happen that are not exactly positive. He also says here, my candle was nearly burnt out. Now, this is ambiguous. It could mean a couple of things. It could mean, literally, as it says, that his candle has nearly finished burning out. It could also be figurative. It could be metaphorical here. We often talk about candle being burnt out as a sign of death. It could come from perhaps where birthday cakes have candles on, and candles being burnt out is often a metaphorical symbol for your time being up, your life being at an end. So that's a metaphor there. Just looking to see what we can highlight next. I'm going to change my colour to pink when I do structure, so you can see the difference. I've got here a rhetorical question that I'm going to highlight for structure, and immediately I can see these exclamatory sentences here for structure too. And indeed, actually throughout the extract, there's quite a few uses of semicolon, which suggest, they show us that there are long, complex sentences. So we've got colons and semicolons all over the place. Let's just highlight those so we can see how many there are, quite a lot. Okay, good. That might be about it for now. There's probably more in there that I haven't seen. You guys may have seen things that I've missed. But essentially at this stage, the annotations, you're spotting features. Now, as all of you will know, It's not enough to just be able to pick out what the names of the features are, but you do need to be able to do that in order to then talk about them in more detail. So if you leave your answer just at picking out the features, it becomes a very thin, vague, uninteresting answer. What we're going to do with it next is talk about how we can talk about those features in detail and make our analysis responses interesting. But at this stage, the annotation stage, you really just need to be able to pick out the interesting things that are being used in the extract, and then you can move on to decide how you're going to talk about them. And that's the next stage we're going to look at now. Now, a question like this is typical of exam papers, end-of-unit assessments, and any kind of analysis question. It usually asks you to consider language and structure in your answers, and as we annotated, you will have seen that I used two colours to help myself be really clear on what counts as language and what counts as structure. Now, this question asks us, how does the writer use language and structure to convey Victor Frankenstein's feelings towards the creature? We have to remember that Victor Frankenstein is the scientist in this book and not the monster. It's a common misconception that the monster is called Frankenstein. The monster is actually not given a name, he's just called the creature or Frankenstein's monster. So Victor Frankenstein is the scientist, okay, that's important to remember. Now, I happen to know that Frankenstein was written by a lady called Mary Shelley. You may not know that. If you didn't, you do now, certainly. And if you do know the author's name, it is always best to use that instead of saying the writer. It just makes you sound a lot more in touch with the extract and makes you sound like you know more about the text. So we're going to start with Shelley, and then we could use shows here, but I'm going to use portrays because it sounds more sophisticated. I'm going to say Frankenstein as feeling. So what I'm doing already is directly linking my answer to the question. The question asks us how Frankenstein feels, and I'm saying that Shelley portrays Frankenstein as feeling, so I can tell my examiner straight away that I'm referring to the question. And I'm going to go with fearful first, because I think what I'm going to pick out is that assonance, that repeated use of A sounds that we saw in the extract, and I'm going to talk about that. So, as feeling fearful, through the use of assonance. I'm going to say she describes Victor as feeling anxiety. Oh no. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to embed my evidence. So feeling an anxiety that almost amounted to agony. So embedding your evidence is a much stronger way of putting your quotations into your answer. You can say things like, the quote that shows this is, but as students of my class in particular will know, I hate those phrases. They waste time in your exam. Any English teacher will tell you the same. And it is much more sophisticated if you can embed your answer, your quotation, you can embed your quotation straight into your answer. And by that I simply mean, like I've just done here, I'm weaving the quotation so that it is part of the question. She describes Victor as feeling an anxiety that almost amounted to agony. It just sounds much nicer that way and really isn't too difficult to master. So I want to talk about two things here. I want to mention the use of the language, anxiety and agony, but I also want to talk about the assonance. I need to make sure that I do link it back to the technique that I've mentioned already. So I'm going to start by mentioning the uses of the word anxiety and agony in there. And I'm going to say, not only does this phrasing mention anxiety, and make sure that I put those in quotation marks too, because again, they are quoted words. And agony, language that has connotations of negativity. That is, that we associate negative things with those words. But the repeated vowel sounds, that's just me showing off that I know what assonance is, could be interpreted as mimicking a scream, like the A, kind of like wide open vowel sounds. You have to open your mouth wide when you're screaming, so you could say that it mimics a scream. It's important to note that I am using what we call tentative language. I'm saying things like could be interpreted as, or might be, could suggest. We're not giving definitive answers on what the writer was trying to do. We don't know that, but we can offer our interpretations of them. So keep your language nice and tentative. Could, might, may suggest. And then just make sure I link it back to my question. So it could be interpreted as mimicking a scream, which links to his feeling of terror, because at the beginning of the paragraph I spoke about how he was feeling fearful. So I'm bringing that full circle back to the beginning. My next paragraph, I am going to talk about the juxtaposition that we picked out. His lustrous black hair, his teeth of pearly whiteness, and how surprising those positive descriptions of him are amidst the sort of fear that Frankenstein is feeling. So I am going to say Shelley has also used juxtaposition. So I'm going straight in with my piece of terminology there throughout the extract to describe the creature, which offers the idea that Frankenstein has mixed feelings about the creature. So that's my second point. I'm using juxtaposition as my terminology, and I'm going to talk about how this displays Frankenstein's mixed feelings about the creature. So Victor describes, oh actually I'm going to add Victor as the first person narrator, because it adds that we know a little bit more subject terminology to impress our examiner. Victor as the first person narrator describes the creature as having, and embed that quotation again, lustrous black hair and teeth of pearly whiteness, which is interesting to us, isn't it? It's interesting because, and here I'm just going to talk about my interpretations of the words lustrous and black, those real zoomed in connotations of those words, what we associate with them, what do they make us think of, how do they make us feel, do they make us think of any other words? So I'm going to say because lustrous, and remember it's still a quotation, is overwhelmingly positive. Notice how I'm upgrading my language and adding to what I'm saying as I go. You're not expected to write perfect analysis the first time. Revisit your answers, edit yourself, think consistently as you write about how you might be able to make that stronger. Lustrous is overwhelmingly positive, while black tends to have connotations. Oh, spell that properly, miss. Connotations of evil and death. I know all of you can do that. Now I'm going to talk about the teeth quotation, because I don't think you should really put a quotation in unless you're going to mention something about it. So I'm going to say, similarly, for a creature with, I want to say something negative about him so I can contrast it with the white teeth. Let's talk about the skin barely covering his muscles. A creature with skin barely covering the work of muscles and arteries beneath. It is surprising that he should be conveyed as having pearly white teeth. I'm going to use a semicolon there. This is a trait we would normally only associate with positive or kind characters. Now I need to link that back to my question nice and clearly, so perhaps this suggests that Frankenstein does not feel pure fear for the creature, but is in awe of him too. He is amazed by the creature, not just in fear of him. Okay, now, so far I've talked about the language in this extract. I've given examples of assonance and of juxtaposition. I haven't talked about structure yet. I have to do that. There are questions in the exam papers where I can't get more than 2 out of 6 marks, for example, if I don't talk about language and structure. So that is 1/3 of your marks that you have access to, and 2/3 that you would not have access to at all if you don't talk about both, even if your points about language are beautiful and extensive. You cannot get more than 1/3 of those marks, so it's really worth making sure you do both. So now I'm going to do structure, and I'm going to start my structural point with structurally, just because it signposts to anyone reading it. But I'm going to talk about structure now, and I haven't forgotten about it. Structurally, the passage uses, I'm going to talk about the complex sentences first, and the semicolons. Now, I am going to say that those add more detail, but I'm not going to leave it there. It's tempting to say this adds more information. But if we only say that and we don't then link it back to our question and make it specific, it's not going to be very interesting to read, and it's not going to tell us very much. So I'm going to make it nice and specific to our question. I'm going to say that it adds more detail regarding the creature's appearance. And now I'm going to make it really linked to our question. This implies, remember, not shows, but implies or conveys, portrays, suggests, connotes, highlights, indicates, any of those that I go on about all the time. This implies that Frankenstein is extremely occupied, almost hypnotized by It's almost like he wants to study him rather than run away. I'm going to say rather than flee. Okay. I'm going to drop in a little bit more subject terminology here because I want to make a mention of the exclamatory sentences as well. So I'm going to say, and you don't always have to do a furthermore, but in this point I have something extra to say, so I'm going to add it. Furthermore, this is supported by the exclamatory sentences. Remember, exclamatory sentences are just sentences that use an exclamation mark. That's all. They exclaim something. That might be something that creates fear, surprise, anger, shock. An exclamation mark or an exclamatory sentence can do any of those things. In this particular example, they seem to suggest a shock, a surprise, but not a completely negative one. Frankenstein is saying that the creature is beautiful. He is slightly in fear of it, he is also in awe of it, and part of him is absolutely awestruck by its beauty, by its kind of dark beauty. He's created this monster himself, and I think he's feeling quite proud of that in some ways. It's almost like he's a parent, a strange parent to this creature. So, this is supported by the exclamatory sentences when Shelley says, when Shelley uses religious imagery. As me mentioning, I'm just dropping in those names of subject terminology wherever I can, just to show that I know it. I'm going to put my quotation in here, great God. Not forgetting the punctuation, of course. I often see students who are quoting rhetorical questions or quoting exclamatory sentences, and then they forget to put the piece of punctuation in their quote, which is obviously important if that's the structural feature you're going to speak about. Okay, so I'm going to say about this. Now, the other important thing, I'm just going to pause for a second, the other important thing to remember is that if you've given a quotation like this, for example, great God, it's important that you, if you're writing about structure, that you actually do talk about the exclamatory sentence, the fact that he's exclaiming it. You can mention, of course, the religious imagery, as I've done. I've mentioned mentioned the term religious imagery, but you don't want to go into too much detail in this paragraph about the connotations of the word great and the links to religion and the connotations of the word God. This paragraph, because I'm talking about structure, I want to make sure that I say enough about the effect of the exclamatory sentence itself. What does the fact that he is exclaiming this suggest about how he feels? Not just what he's saying, but how he is saying it. That's what's important here. Of course, if it was a language point I was making and I was talking about religious imagery, then I can go into much more detail about the connotations of the words that are used. But at this point, I want to make sure that I am talking about the structural feature that I've picked out. Okay, so, great God, Frankenstein. What do I want to say about this? So, Frankenstein partly sees the creature as beautiful, which I can put in a quotation still, because it is a quotation, which is intriguing. Because he's clearly a frightful being too. So he's clearly frightful as well as beautiful. So it's intriguing that he is exclaiming that he's beautiful. It's intriguing because he is clearly a frightful being too. And then finally, to link back to my question, I'm going to say that he's almost enchanted by the monster. Which links back to what I said up here about being hypnotised. being almost enchanted by the monster. And then my final point, I'm going to do 2 language and 2 structure. So my final point, I'm going to do structure so that it's an even balance between language and structure. I'm going to go with the rhetorical questions. So finally, Shelley uses rhetorical questions to convey that Frankenstein is feeling unsure of himself. Let's say that. After awakening the creature. Okay, he's not sure of himself. That's the point I'm going to make here with the rhetorical questions. I've got to give my evidence. So his question is, how can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe? Now, the quotation is a lot longer than that, but I don't want to write. Let me just change that spelling as well. What is that? That spelling was a catastrophe. The quotation I want to use is a lot longer than this, but I don't want to include the whole thing. So anywhere where you don't need to include the entire quotation, you just want a small part of it, you can use square brackets here and then an ellipsis in the middle, and that sort of tells your examiner that you're taking a chunk out of the middle of the quotation. So you don't have to type the whole thing or write the whole thing. Okay. So I'm going to leave my quotation there. Then I'm going to say about it, I want to say that as well as getting Frankenstein's reactions to the monster, we also get a clearer picture of how these events affect the creator and how he's feeling mentally about himself. Because there is a lot of commentary about the idea that Frankenstein and the monster are actually very similar characters and interchangeable in some ways because they both have reasons to feel guilty. We're not going to go into that here because obviously this is an analysis skill video, but look that up if you're interested in that, or if you haven't read Frankenstein, then you should read it. It's excellent. So I'm going to put those 2 things I just said into a sort of succinct point. I'm going to say, not only does Shelley provide us as readers with Frankenstein's reactions to the monster, we also receive an understanding of how these events affected the creator and his mental stability too. And then finally, I'm just going to again tie that back to my question and say the fact that he adds, so I'm going to give the end of that quotation now, I had endeavoured to form. It brings it back to the idea that he feels personally guilty. Strongly suggests that he is feeling immense guilt and torment for being for being the human that is personally responsible for creating such a... Oh, it calls the monster a wretch, doesn't it? Delineate wretch. I'm going to put that in there just for extra effect. lineate wretch. It's a nice way to finish off my points. Okay, so those are my points there. I've got point 1 talks about assonance, that's a language point. Point 2 is a second language point, talks about juxtaposition. Point 3 is a structural point and talks about multiple complex sentences and semicolons. And then finally, point 4 is another structural point, and it talks about rhetorical questions. Now, I'm just going to show you a quick colour coding of this, and I encourage you to do the same with your answer. It's important to see that each of your points has got all of the key ingredients in it. Now, some of you like to follow structure. I know that some of you like a really tight sort of PEAL or PE paragraph to help you structure your answer. And for some of you, that is absolutely the right way to go because it helps you remember everything to include in each point. Some of you, however, might be feeling a little bit bored with that structure, or might be feeling that your writing in that structure isn't as effective as it could be and that you're repeating yourself quite a bit. If that applies to you, then feel free to colour code your points, see that you've got all the right ingredients in each point, and then have a practice with sort of moving the order around a little bit. You don't have to start your points with Shelley portrays Dr. Frankenstein as feeling fearful through the use of assonance. You know, you could give a quotation first, tell me the piece of terminology, and then go into what that suggests about how he's feeling. You can put the quotation in towards the middle of it, like I've done. You can talk about the terminology first. You can put the connotations of the language first, and then give a quotation, and then talk about the terminology. It doesn't really matter too much, as long as it sounds grammatically correct and is effective for the reader listening, and that you've included all of those key elements in each point somewhere. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be as restrictive. I think the reason that and I do this too, that teachers will tell you to use this structure of PEE is because it does help you to remember all the things to put in. But once you're used to remembering all the things to go in there, feel free to play around with your structure, add things to it, move the order of the elements in your paragraph until you feel like it sounds interesting and original and innovative, because it doesn't always sound like that when you do each paragraph in exactly the same way. So colour code along with me. I'm going to make the language points. Let's make the language points blue. Let's make the language point there blue. I'm going to make structure purple when I find it in my answer, and anywhere where I've linked back to Frankenstein's feelings towards the creature, because that's my question, I'll make that green. I'll make quotations yellow, and maybe sophisticated vocabulary as pink too, just so you can see all of those things in my answer. So first of all, in the first sentence there I use portrays instead of shows. I've got assonance here, which is a language feature, and I've also got Frankenstein as feeling fearful as my link to question. We've got a quotation in here, an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, and then we've got mention of connotations, which is language terminology, and then we talk about his feeling of terror, which is a feeling. We've also got the word interpreted here, which is a nice bit of sophisticated vocabulary. In this paragraph we've got juxtaposition as language terminology, and then we've got Frankenstein having mixed feelings about the creature. That links to the question. We've got first person narrator. I'm going to call that structure because I think that links mostly to sort of overall structure of something, what narrative stance that it's in. Then we've got quotations here, lustrous black, teeth of pearly whiteness. We've also got work of muscles and arteries beneath. We've got the word lustrous there, the word black there. We've got connotations again here. We've got the word conveyed, which I'm going to give pink. Conveyed. Suggests. And then again, another link back to the question. Frankenstein does not feel pure fear, but is in awe of him too. And then here, as you can see, I have mentioned complex sentence semicolons, that's structural. I've used implies instead of shows, that goes there. Oh, that's annoying. Oh no. There we go. I've used exclamatory sentences there, which is a structural feature. I've mentioned religious imagery here, which is a language feature. I've given a quotation here of great God. Beautiful. I'm going to go back to pink because I've used the word intriguing, which is fancy. And then I'm going to go back to green for the final sentence, Frankenstein being hypnotised. Enchanted, which links back to how he feels. And then in the final paragraph we've got mention of rhetorical questions, structural feature. Mention of Frankenstein feeling unsure of himself after waking up the creature. That's linking back to the question. Then we've got this quotation here, rhetorical question. And again, this quotation. Then we've got pink for suggests instead of shows. To the question of him feeling immense guilt and torment. And then we've got a couple of bits of quotation at the end there. So as you can see, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 colours that I've used here. And you should be looking for using all of those colours at some point in each of your points. So the only one that should differ is you might have purple for structure or light blue for language. But every other colour should appear in each of your points. So language, we have to remember, there we go, this colour. Structure, let's put that in this colour. Quotations, putting that in yellow. Links to the question, and putting that in green. And then sophisticated vocabulary, I'm putting in pink. Now obviously you can use different colours to me, but pause the video now and have a go, if you haven't already, at colour coding your answer so you can see that you've got all 5 of those colours in each of your points. Remember, you may only have one of these 2. If it's a language point, you're going to have that colour and those 3. If it's a structure point, you'll have that colour and those 3. So, as I said, if you haven't already, pause the video, have a go at colour coding your own response and seeing if there's a pattern in terms of which colour you miss out most. That will become your target to work on for future responses. And other than that, the main thing to remember I'm just going to start a new piece of paper here. The main tips, I suppose, to remember are to read your question really carefully. Sounds like a phrase that teachers use all the time, so much that it doesn't mean anything anymore. But please read your question carefully. If it asks you to talk about language and structure, do. Focus on what the question is asking you about. If you start talking about how the reader is engaged or how the extract builds tension, and actually it's asking you about a particular character or a particular feeling or mood or setting, for example, then you just won't be answering the question. It won't get you the marks you need. So read your question carefully, highlight it, annotate it, make sure you know what you're looking for before you read your extract. Read your extract is the second step, obviously. Can't really do much without that. And I'm going to say, read it twice. The first time you read it, spend time gathering information on the mood, on the setting, on the actual plot. It's hard for you to write about an analysis of a piece of writing if you don't know what's actually happened in the scene. So spend time, you don't have to know every detail of the plot or the story from the novel as a whole, but spend time knowing what happens in the actual extract. It'll save you from looking like a fool later when you aren't able to write accurately about what's going on. So read the extract the first time just to get a general understanding of it, and the second time read actively. So on the second time you're going to read and highlight, annotate at the same time with the names of language and structural features that you find as you read. Okay, so on that second reading, you're highlighting, picking out, listing, however you want to plan it, all the features and techniques that you see being used in there. You aren't going to end up writing about all of them, but the more you can collect as you go along means that you've got a better chance of writing about the most effective ones when it comes to the analysis time. So once you've highlighted everything, your next step is obviously to either make a plan. Some people like a little plan, and you can spend just a few minutes jotting down which techniques you intend to talk about and what you're going to say about them. Or some people like to go straight into the writing. I know I prefer that. Go straight into the answer. Now you can do that. Make sure whichever way round you do it, that each of your points has either language or structure, terminology, that it has quotations, unless you're talking about something like paragraph length, in which case you wouldn't copy out the entire paragraph, but other than that you need quotations, that you need sophisticated vocabulary, so avoiding things like shows where you can, and using things like suggests, conveys, portrays, indicates, highlights, just to make it sound more sophisticated, and that you include links back to the question. That one's really important. Because you could be writing the most beautiful answer you've ever written in your life. If it doesn't link back to the question you were given, it's not going to get you the marks. Sad times. Okay. Have a go at any of those answers. I'll look forward to reading some of your work if you can submit it to me. But yeah, obviously feel free to come back to this video at any point. You can skip through all of the boring bits now that you've heard me talk through it. But come back at any point if you are unsure about how I did any of it, and equally leave comments on our classroom page if you want me to clarify anything or go over it again. Equally, I want to see how this one went in terms of popularity, and if people like it and use it, and if it goes really well, obviously I can make more. You can let me know what you liked about it, what you didn't like, and which key skills you might like me to make videos for in the future. But in the meantime, have fun, analyse lots, and I'll see you soon. Bye.